John Schempf is a licensed marriage and family therapist. Boy, tongue-tied. John provides individual, couples, marital, and family therapy, child and adolescent counseling, veterans counseling, spiritual counseling and drumming, and wilderness and art therapy. John joined Hope in 2010 and has more than 20 years of experience providing drug and alcohol abuse intervention, prevention, screening, and counseling. He served in the U.S. Coast Guard on active duty for more than 22 years. John has a Master of Arts degree in psychology, marriage and family therapy specialty from Saybrook University. I remember when it was Saybrook Institute. I stumbled over that one. A master's in science degree in quality systems improvement from the National Graduate School and Research Center, and a bachelor's of arts degree in psychology from Sonoma State University. John has volunteered for over 20 years as a youth mentor, providing education, coaching, and leadership with the Petaluma Unified School District, the Petaluma Boys and Girls Clubs, Petaluma Little League, Pop Warner Football, and CYO, the Catholic Youth Organization Basketball. John has also been a Boy Scouts of America trained scout leader and youth mentor / spiritual counselor with a local church. John's lifelong goal is to further his own professional development and professional exploration with compassionate regard for all humanity through ongoing work, research, education, and contemplative, mindful spiritual practices. Let's welcome John.
That was a lot of an intro there. That was written a long time ago. Good job digging that up, Patrick. And it was fun. I mean, it was a little embarrassing, but it was fun to reflect on that. Yeah. So first thing, today is Go Red for Women, and that's about cardiac heart disease. And males, we know it's chest pain and radiates down the left arm. Top 3 for women: back pain, jaw pain, and nausea or flu-like symptoms that show up often weeks before a cardiac event. So I just wanted to, and also to trust your woman's intuition and go to the hospital. So I just that came up, and I just wanted to share that. So on the intro, I said, what kind of person decides to join the military for low pay, arduous duty, separation from loved ones, and inherent danger from life threats? And what kind of person decides that marrying a military person is a good idea based on separation from or loss of loved ones, frequent moving, new job, and that's the standard operating procedure for military members and their families, often with young children. I wanted to just say for a second, a disclaimer in the online. It said that I am active duty. I was active duty. I stopped in 2010. Well, I reached 22 years, and when you hit 20, you can get about 25% of your pay for the rest of your life, and so that was a good deal. And thank you very much. And people say, you get paid by taxes. Well, I paid taxes, so I basically paid my own salary. That's a joke. Sorry. I wanted to ask if we have any veterans in the room that'd be willing to just raise their hand. Right on. I knew there were a few here, so thanks for your service. And usually they won't admit to this, but do we have any combat veterans? Right on. Thanks, Joe Petzel. And that's a big deal. And I also wanted to ask, are there any family members of veterans in the room? Right on. Look at that. Yeah. And how many folks here have treated active duty or veterans in their service or in their therapy, in their practice? Yeah. So a lot there. Quick bio. Yeah, I got to be a scout leader for my kids, and I love it. And I'm a scout master still. And we were actually inclusive and diverse when it wasn't allowed by scouting, and we were breaking the rules in Petaluma. So, and we've been doing that for 25 years. The folks that I hang out with. So. There's a lot of values there, and I want to make sure that we're not doing the the bad stuff, the lack of inclusion. I play drums in a church band, and I have a motorcycle. So those are my fun things. Let's see, in 1988, I joined the reserves out at Station Bodega Bay. I joined the Coast Guard. I was active duty in Alameda. I was part of the training detachment for the first Gulf War. I was a medic and part of the training the port security units there in Camp Blanding, Florida. In '91, I was Operation Summer Stock at Station Niagara Falls. First time I encountered a dead body. We pulled somebody out of the water that had gone over the falls, probably in a suicide, probably a week or so earlier. So I'll save you the details on that. In 1992, out of Alameda, I was on the Coast Guard cutter Sherman. We would go out for 2 months, come back for a month. I did that for 3 years. A lot of trips to Alaska. The deadliest catch, the crabbers that sometimes sink, we were searching for one of those once. In 1995, I had been an EMT for a long time, and I became an EMT instructor at the training center here in Petaluma. At that time, I was divorced, and my kids live in Petaluma, so it was kind of a career suicide thing to go into training. In '99, I was a law enforcement instructor for the Coast Guard. So the Coast Guard is a law enforcement agency as well as lifesavers. Let's see, in '03, kind of because I got in trouble with alcohol back in '94, but in '03 I became a substance abuse prevention specialist for the Coast Guard and a graduate of the Navy Drug and Alcohol Counselor School. In '08, I started at Saybrook because I wanted to get my LMFT. I forgot to mention I'm nervous. You're my peers, and so that's okay. Hopefully we'll get through it. In 2010, I was doing my internship at Family Service Agency. How many FSA alumni are in here today? Look at that. Is that incredible? And my supervisor, and most of our supervisors, the guy that was our supervisor, Joe Petzel, is here. Thanks, Joe. And Joe spoke a couple of months ago, and I appreciate that. Let's see, I also worked at Rincon Valley School District and my internship, and also at Hope Counseling, and I still work at Hope down in Petaluma. And then in 2011, after getting out of the Coast Guard in 2010, I got hired back. I work full-time as a family advocacy specialist, and what I do is I do case management for domestic violence, child abuse. So I'm working with CPS, I'm working with the command, I'm working with law enforcement, I'm working with victims and perpetrators and allegations and case management. And I still continue to see, I have 6 time slots at Hope on Monday evening and Wednesday evening. So that's it for that. So there's the title. And there are the objectives. And I'll just let you glance over those quickly. And what really I'm looking at, or I'm trying to share with you, is there are some specifics, there are some peculiarities, there are some stigmas, there are some challenges and obstacles, there's a culture, there are some ideas on how to be open, encouraging, and collaborative in your counseling milieu with veterans and active duty folks and their families. All right, I'm going to give you a quick history of some things, a little bit about Coast Guard, a little bit about the military. I guess that didn't click. There we go. So, excuse me. Coast Guard was actually formed in 1790. We've been in the Department of Treasury, the Department of Navy, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Homeland Security. In 1790, it's a good thing I wrote it down, Alexander Hamilton, I know that name, but I would have just forgotten it, was the Secretary of Treasury, and they needed to pay off the war debt, and there were a lot of smuggling happening, and so they commissioned 12 cutters to be the revenue cutter service to impose tariffs on imports and smuggling, et cetera, and to pay for the war debt. I'm going to move on and talk about the other services. Claim their dates as, you can see they're all 1775, June, October, November, except for the Air Force. And then we also now have the U.S. Space Force. I didn't get that on there yet. Sorry about that. There are some Snickers. We'll get into we'll get into a little bit of that in a second. So back to where does the Coast Guard start? The Coast Guard starts back in 1790 with the Revenue Cutter Service. There's one of the original revenue cutters. That's the Cutter Eagle. That's actually the modern day Eagle, and that was actually a World War II war prize from Germany. We use that for our cadets. They get a summer cruise. It's a working cruise for officers in Officer Candidate School or at the academy. Let's see. So another aspect of the Coast Guard, going way back even to 1716, was the lighthouses and then the lighthouse service. So you've got the revenue cutter, you got the lighthouse service. Then you have the life-saving stations and the surfmen, okay? And then you have the steamboat inspection, you have bridges and boats, safety equipment. If you look on a life jacket, it says U.S. Coast Guard approved. Bridges over navigable waters, ATON, which is aids to navigation, all the buoys and stuff. And all of that came into the modern Coast Guard in 1915. 1917, World War I, the Coast Guard's in the Navy. World War II, the Coast Guard's in the Navy. That's part of the war effort. And then in 1967, the Coast Guard becomes part of the Department of Transportation because of the waterways, and that seemed to make the most sense. Why is the Coast Guard not in the Department of Defense? So the Constitution says that a standing Army or a standing Navy, I guess the Navy floats, shall not enforce laws upon the civilian populace. But we needed some law enforcement on the water. So the Coast Guard became law enforcement on the water as far back as 1790, but it couldn't be in the Department of the Army or Navy except in time of war. So they moved it outside, Department of Treasury, Department of Transportation, and then after 9/11, the Department of Homeland Security. So the Coast Guard is now in the Department of Homeland Security. Let's see, the Coast Guard has been involved in every major military action that our country's been in. Sorry about the misspelling. Wasn't able to get it corrected here, but I don't know, anyway. It's my humility moment. I got it programmed in there, so as long as I stay out of the way, we're going to be okay. The river boats in Vietnam were run by the Coast Guard. Let's see, what else do I want to say? So I want to talk a little bit about diversity. The military has often been what I like to refer to as a reluctant leader in diversity. They were forced into integration, even back as, well, it kind of started in the Civil War, but not really. But that was the beginnings, right? And then integration became more prevalent in the 50s, and well, in the 40s and the 50s, in the 60s, of course. And then inclusion, let's see, the inclusion of women, and it's recently women are now in combat roles, so there's been some movement there. Don't Ask, Don't Tell wasn't great, but it was movement in the right direction, and now same-sex couples, sexual orientation, race, gender, socioeconomic, elder, all these categories, as civil rights are for all of us, are protected for military members as well. Until recently, we had a pretty robust transgender policy. And I'll talk a little bit about our chain of command in a minute, but the President of the United States is the commander-in-chief of all military services, including the Coast Guard. and repealed or rolled back some of that or all of that transgender policy. And I'm proud to say that the Commandant of the Coast Guard at the time, Admiral Schempf, stood up on the House floor, I believe it was House floor, the Senate floor, and basically said, no, we're not going to mistreat anybody that's in the Coast Guard. Now, coming in and moving forward, we don't have much choice, but I was proud of him to say that. All right, that's what I got there on that. A little bit on women's spars from World War II. The Coast Guard cutter Bear, Captain Michael Healy, that was a revenue cutter back in the day. Alex Haley, and a little bit more. So we've got the modern Coast Guard now. And I'll give you some of the missions of the modern Coast Guard. The missions of the modern Coast Guard there are 11. Port, I was going to move around a lot, wasn't I, Joe? I haven't moved yet. Port and waterway security, that makes sense, right? And we do port and waterway security in foreign countries where there are American interests or service members. We protect the Navy or Army or Air Force or Marines in coastal environments. So port security overseas. Drug interdiction, I mentioned a little bit about aids to navigation, buoys and lights and things like that. Search and rescue, which is what the Coast Guard's really known for. Living marine services, or excuse me, living marine resources, marine safety, defense readiness, migrant interdiction, which is controversial, of course, marine environmental protection, ice operations, and as I mentioned earlier, law enforcement. So that's a lot about the Coast Guard, but that's who I am and that's what I know. So I figured I could share that with some folks because anybody learn something new about the Coast Guard? All right. Hopefully it wasn't too much of a time killer. So I was talking about the chain of command, and so the commander-in-chief is going to be the President of the United States. And then you have the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and those are going to be the generals and admirals from all the services, Army, Navy, Marine, Air Force, Coast Guard. There are a few other uniformed services, the United Public Health Service, NOAA, National Organization of Atmospheric Association. It's not organization, I forget NOAA right now. But the 5 main services, remember that the Marines are actually part of the Navy, although they wouldn't like to admit it. So you're going to have then those joint chiefs, and then each service has its own branch in government. So you've got the Secretary of Defense, and that's going to be in charge of Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, and Space Force. And then you have the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, and we're a major part of the Department of Homeland Security, along with, unfortunately, and you can see I kind of tend to be a less military person. I'm super progressive, super left-leaning. But where was I going with that? ICE is part of the Department of Homeland Security, Border Patrol, DEA, and a few others, and I can't remember them right now. Then you're going to have the Secretary of the Army. Each service has their own secretary, and those are civilians. And then all services have an active duty component. All services have a reserve component. And then you have National Guard. And National Guard's a little different. The Army has their own National Guard. So you have Army Reserve, and then you have Army National Guard. And then each state has a National Guard. And they're all kind of under the Army. One thing that happened during the first Gulf War was that a lot of National Guard and Reserve folks were sent over because the active duty forces were pretty low, or they had less folks in them. And so we had a lot of older family folks heading over into combat. It was a tough time. Anyway, just a note on that. Let's see, what else do I got? And then at each unit, you're going to have, well, how do I want to put this? The Coast Guard is divided up into the Pacific area and the Atlantic area. The Pacific area and Atlantic area, and then it's divided up generally by states. District 11 is California, 13 is going to be Washington, Oregon, 14 is Hawaii, 17 is Alaska. There were more, and they were split up into different halves, and that's why the numbers are a little off. And so there'll be commanders of that. Then you've got bases. You've got, so for instance, I started out at Station Bodega Bay. That's a small boat station. There are small boats there. Tied up next to that's a little tiny cutter. And the cutter's its own unit. And then you have the training center, which is here. And then in San Francisco, there's an air station. There are a bunch of other small boat stations. So you've got air stations, small boat stations, you've got bases, you've got training centers, and each of them then are going to have a commanding officer. Somebody's a commanding officer, all of them, and then each one of those has a commanding officer. And then there's an executive officer. So why am I sharing this with you? Well, when you talk to somebody, you kind of know who they are, where they are. They're going to have a supervisor. They're going to have a department head. And then the XO, or the XPO, we don't have to get into that, is going to really be in charge of everything that runs the base, but they're second in command. And so, any questions on that? And I'll just mention that then you have junior officers, and then you have chiefs or sergeants, which are your mid-level managers. All right, let's see. Let's get into some good stuff here. Let's get into military culture. So there has been a shift towards supporting our troops. I've talked to people that actually did fly from Vietnam into San Francisco airport, get off the plane, and were actually spit on by folks. Now, yes, there were horrible things. There are always horrible things that happen in every single war. And who are we sending to these wars? You can join the military at 17, literally with a note from your mother. You can obviously join at 18. Most of our, and I'll get into the statistics in a little bit, but most of our folks join at 17, 18, 19, 20 years old. So we're sending kids over, boys at the time, and women. There were plenty of women that were in Vietnam and harmed. But the shift has been to supporting our troops. Yellow ribbons everywhere. And that's a really good thing. Let's see. Positive characteristics of our troops. Great people to hire. And you hear that all the time from employers. Loyal, helpful, courteous, kind of sounds like the Boy Scout oath. Middle class, opportunities. That pay starts out pretty low, but as you move up in rank, you can have a pretty good income. And then higher standards of grooming and punctuality, et cetera. And so that has a lot to do with being good employees. I want to just stop for a second. There was a great study that was, I've got that here. 75% of Americans that are eligible to be in the military, or they could serve, they're not eligible. The study says, I like the word, it says ready, willing, and unable to serve. 75% of our youth can't get into the military. Why is that? You need a high school diploma or at least a GED. Obesity, weight standards. We have a prevalence of obesity in our society, and attendant poor health. You have drug use, alcohol use, abuse, criminal activity does preclude. And that isn't the way it used to be. I'll talk a little bit about the old recruiting methods, but sometimes you got in trouble and went to the judge, and your option was to go to jail or go to the military. Not a high standard of recruiting. And then debt is another thing. And now debt's tied into, can you be blackmailed because you're in debt? And if you can be blackmailed because you're in debt, then you're a threat to security. So there's a little bit of that. Alrighty, where are we going now? What else do I got? So challenges to transitioning to the civilian world. A lot of times folks will go from home into the military, and the military takes care of people, probably codependently. 3 hots in a cot, you're told when to wake up, make your bed, this is what you're going to wear every day, this is how you're going to iron it, you're going to shave, this is what you need to look like, we're going to tell you where to be, when to be, we're going to feed you when it's time for you to, it's completely controlled. And then when folks get out of that, they're kind of lost maybe, or don't have a lot of worldly skills. Even folks that have been in 20, 30 years. There's a pretty horrendous statistic that retirees, and it's changing now, but it used to be that the life expectancy after retirement was 3 years. They just didn't have anything, they didn't have anything to do. They were in charge of everything, and now they're in charge of nothing. So, and qualified by, or what's the word I'm looking for, defined by their job. That's kind of true for a lot of guys, maybe most guys still. You know, first thing we ask a guy, what do you do? Generally, it's changing. So challenges. Okay, and then I like to share this a lot. The top 3 stressors in anybody's life: moving, new job, loss of family. And if you just kind of shift that around a little bit, Coast Guard, military personnel are going to move. I've got the statistic coming up, but it's usually every year, 2 years at the most. If you can really stretch it out, you can get a 4-year tour. But most of the time, you're going to advance, or you're going to change specialties, or things happen and people are going to transfer out within a year or two. You're going to now be at a new place, a new place of employment, a new boss, new supervisor, and a lot of new job skills, or a different area. So there's a new job, another great stressor. And you're going to be separated from family. Not only will you deploy, that means maybe go on a ship. I was on a ship for 3 years. We would go out for 2 months, come back for a month, so in 3 years, I was gone for 2. Just an interesting side note. The day I got back from deployment was exactly like the day after I left for me, right? 'Cause I was gone doing this, and then I came back to my life, and it was like the day after I left, because I didn't have 2 months of living here. But my family did. They had gone on with their lives, and my friends and our communities. Just an interesting note. So, and then, in addition to deployment, you've got duty. Everybody's got to stay on duty. Everything's got to be run. I'll just give you a brief synopsis of the military. Everything that you can imagine that has to be done, there's a job specialty for that. So if you have to have an electrician, you have to have electronics technicians, you have to have IT people, you have to have people that can saw wood and pound nails and weld, you have to have people that cook, you have to have people that are corpsmen, that are medical personnel, you have to have people that are in charge of the paperwork, your HR, you have to have people that are in charge of shipping and receiving and supply and ordering stuff. You have to have people that do wastewater management, and we have clergy, and we have firefighters, and we have anything you can think of that a city has. You have to have that on a fully self-contained base, or on a fully self-contained ship, or a small unit. So everybody has to stay on duty. It's 24/7. The doors are open, the lights are on, somebody's at the phone, somebody's on the helm, somebody's on lookout, and so we divide that up. Usually 1 in 4. That means so you divide up the day into fourths, and we work all day, and then at night you stand duty from maybe 8 to midnight, or from midnight to 4 in the morning. That's called the mid-watch. Or maybe you got anyway, I won't say the shanks, which is the 4 to 8 in the morning, because then you're working from 4 in the morning until 8 in the morning, but then it's 8 in the morning, and now you get to go to your regular work, and work 8 to 4, right? 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. plus duty. And sometimes you can get a little compensation time. Anyway, so where I'm going with this is that's time away from family. You're spending the night on the ship. You're spending 2 months on the ship. So the top 3 stressors: moving, new job, loss of family. And then, of course, for families or for couples, money, sex, and kids. So that's kind of when I'm talking to folks and talking about stressors. Let's see. Yeah, it told everything to do. We got 3 hots and a cot here. I mentioned that. Our Vietnam veterans, 17 years old. Okay. Any questions so far? I mean, to be better at the end, but if anybody's got like a jumping out of something, we can do a quick runner for a question. All right, great. There's a question right there. Thanks, Doreen.
When I see you have stressors for couples, money and sex. Can you say a little more about those?
Oh, that's just really overly generalized, but it seems that everybody seems to fight over money, and the military is low pay. As a matter of fact, our entry-level military personnel, based on their pay structure, qualify for food stamps. That's how low the pay is, okay? I don't know. I'm going to get a little bit more into the demographics of who joins the military, but it's still, most of the services are white, male, rigid gender roles, power and control, rigidity, and I'm going to hit all of that in just a second, but that's going to obviously have an impact on sex. And then kids are the number one stressor in people's lives are kids. Well, not the number one, but couples stress goes through the roof when kids are born, and it doesn't go down until they leave the home, right? So there's some studies there. Good enough? All right. What else do we got? So a little bit more on the military culture. So less than 1% of Americans are serving in the military. Actually, it's 0.5%. So right now, there's about 1.29 million service members, and that's roughly 0.5% of the U.S. population. So there are the 1%ers, and then there are the 0.5%ers. So again, who joins the military? There are currently about well, I don't know if it's about, but anyway, the statistic was 18.8 million veterans, and that represents less than 10% of our population have ever served, okay? And that could be folks that served for, usually it's about 180 days before you can kind of technically say that you served, but it could be less, but generally it's going to be 6 months to 30 years, or sometimes even longer. But generally, you're not allowed to stay in the military after 30 years. And then there's also, if you don't attain certain ranks by certain time periods, then it's up or out from the military. So can't just kind of stay there. So I wanted to talk a little bit about early recruiting. Shanghai is where in a bar, and a lot of times bars on the coasts, or in ports, on the bay, would be on pilings and piers over the water. And so there's a trap door in the floor, and you give folks liquor that's spiked so they become unconscious, or you hit them over the head. You open the trap drawer, you drop the person to a small boat underneath the bar. They get rowed out to the ship, okay? And this is back when this is a gender biased joke, but this is back when the ships were wood and the men were steel, all right? And they would be rowed out to the boat, and then the boat would leave while the person that was shanghaied was still unconscious, and ships would go out for 2-3 years. And so that's early recruiting. Early recruiting, a lot of prisons were on ships that were moored out in the harbor. Not a lot of people were able to swim, so I think it was they thought it was a good system. I mentioned about the local judges. I mentioned the draft, not great recruiting efforts. So you can kind of see the progression of the military services, not the best of the people were going into the military. If you look, I want to just talk a little bit, I've got it coming up later, but kind of going back to a feudal society where you had the monarch and the serfs, and the monarch would go off to war and take the able-bodied young men from the village and go fight wars. And so it was this captive stuff. All right, I want to just talk a little bit about the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And thanks, Joe. I talked about this a little bit, but I'll tell you what Joe said for that last line, and I remember that. But some of the things that you can be, that are illegal or against regulation, that you can be tried for, convicted, imprisoned, kicked out, fined, are adultery. Here's one I thought was kind of scary. You can, just guess, I don't know, failure to enthusiastically pursue the enemy. See those people over there shooting at us? Go over there, right? What do you think the penalty for failing to enthusiastically pursue the enemy would be? Death, right? That's the most, right? But I mean, that's what we're talking about. Of course, sexual assault, domestic violence, child abuse, false official statements, all kinds of things are under the UCMJ, everything you can think of. But Joe reminded me that the last clause of the UCMJ is that, and anything else we haven't covered, that's covered in here too. And we get to make it up, so thanks, Joe. All righty, good deal. So a little more on military culture. Kind of talked about the recruiting process. You're told you're going to have worldwide travel. We're going to pay for your college, 3 hots and a cot, wonderful, glorious places to serve. Oh, you remember hearing the horrible things. Go to strange new countries, meet wonderful people, and kill them. Great. And then the Navy, it's not just a job, right? It used to be it's an adventure, but the people in the Navy, it's not just a job, it's a janitorial service. So, yeah. But so what's the truth about recruiting? Well, the recruiters want to recruit, and so they kind of make things look medical for life and, free college, and we're going to pay. So you get recruited, and then you go to boot camp, and you get your head shaved, and you're doing push-ups and sit-ups, and somebody's yelling and spitting in your face, and it used to be a whole lot worse. Let's see, and then you make it through boot camp, and then you have to have that specialty. I mentioned, food service, health, medical, any job you can think of, driving a boat. Out here at Training Center Petaluma, we have the electronics technician school, we have the information technologist school, we have when I joined, it was called the subsistence specialist. Then it became the food specialist. Now it's the culinary specialist. So they're really making some good food now. We've got the yeoman. It's what it's called, and that was the pen and quill was the paperwork, the HR. We've got the shipping and receiving, which is called storekeepers, kind of again from tales of yore. We've got the corpsmen, the medical schools, and I forgot one. Sorry. So then you get in the afloat services. It's called a rating. So you become a rated petty officer, 3rd class, 2nd class, 1st class, chief, and that could be like a storekeeper, 3rd class. In the other services, it's called a military occupational specialty, an MOS, same kind of thing, rifleman, mechanic, etc. So it talked about bases, units, ships, air stations. So you've got this 2-tier piece, and I kind of touched on it in the slide before, that kind of, or 2 slides before, that kind of, maybe it was 1 slide before. Yes, that feudal landed gentry thing. I think I'll go back. The enlisted versus officer. So your officers, so it's a 2-tier system. The officers are in charge of the men, and then the enlisted are the people. And then the enlisted are and so in order to become an officer, you have to be a grad. A couple of ways to get in, but if you go into a service academy, you usually have to have a higher than a 4.0 GPA. And then a lot of other group supports, Key Club, leadership, school government, a lot of volunteerism. Eagle Scout looks really good. One thing about Boy Scouting is they're now called Scouts BSA, and we have all girl troops in that. So anybody can be an Eagle Scout. I just found out that I think the Girl Scout is it called Gold Star? Which is also recognized by the military services as equivalent to Eagle Scout, and those folks get a higher, they can come in at a higher pay grade just from that. But usually you have to have those things to go to an officer academy. It's a 4-year school, and you do your 4 years, and you come out as a junior officer, and you obligate another 4 years to that service. You could also have maybe 2 years or 4 years in a civilian and then go to officer candidate school. You can get in that way. You can apply to do that, but ultimately that's the officer corps. The enlisted corps, you only need a GED or a high school diploma, and they're the kind of the workers. And it doesn't make a lot of sense. There really is the joke is for to become an officer, you have to have, from the enlisted perspective, I was enlisted for 22 years. I made it up to the rank of chief petty officer. And the joke amongst the enlisted corps is in order to become an officer, you had to have a lobotomy. And the other joke is, half the work for twice the pay? Psh, absolutely, right? And so, but there's they eat better, they live better, they get paid better, they have better duty, they have better rotation. So there's a disparity between the officers and the enlisted. Okay. I think career versus retirement, I think I kind of covered that. You can get a paycheck. You get about, it's supposed to be about 50% of your pay, but it's 50% of your base pay when you retire, and you don't get your basic allowance for housing. So for here in this area, for a chief petty officer, you're probably getting a couple, $2,000 to $3,000 a month for pay, but then you're getting $3,000 to $4,000 a month for housing allowance. And you're not going to get half of your housing allowance, you're only going to get half of your pay, so that's why I say it's about 25% when you hit 20. If you make it to 30, it's probably close to another 10%, maybe a little more than that. All right, military culture, hyper-masculinity, all right? The Coast Guard, other services are more diverse. Coast Guard is still a white male organization. We're working on it, it's getting better, but, and then power and control. And I've got the military power and control wheel, and I'll put that up next. But first, I had the opportunity to, one of the folks that worked with me until just recently, and just got his PsyD, Nick Gonzalez, reference there in the bottom, did his thesis on hypermasculinity. So, but to kind of before, and you can read kind of where he's coming from and some of my stuff. My bullet is the first bullet, his is the second bullet. But working with men, me personally, I have come, and I'm not even going to say most men, I have come to the place where I have not found an exception yet, so I'm going to go ahead and say all men at the core have an issue of not being good enough. Now, if you look at our society, the standards, the movies, the pictures, the sports, the traditional leadership, the traditional career paths, what do you do? Every man I've talked to can hear their dad or the whole community going, yeah, it's pretty good, but you should have gone that a little extra. You should have given it a little more. You're not quite good enough. You're not quite good enough. You're not quite good enough. Maybe not all men, right? But a lot of men. And I'm going to say that when you start having that not good enough and wanting to strive and drive to, and I'm also talking about me, this is me, to this kind of hero complex. I want to get into a position, I want to be recognized, I'm willing to take some risks, I'm willing to be a firefighter, I'm willing to be law enforcement, I'm willing to be EMS, I'm willing to be in the military, I want to help. And I'm also going to look for a gal that I think looks like she needs some help, right? Or a guy, it doesn't matter. And kind of codependently think that I'm marrying down, so I look, I'm the hero and helping her. And that's not the case, I've found. But that's a little bit later. Let's see, pick last for teams, locker room torture for young men. A lot of stuff. And also this is, you can look at, I've got the, where did I put it? The ACEs study. Right here. And I want to thank Rhonda Shea. She sent this to me just this week, and that's great. This is a wonderful ACEs study, Disparities in Adverse Childhood Experiences Among Individuals with a History of Military Service. And here are their results. Those with military experience had greater odds of any difference in prevalence of ACEs. So what they're getting at is in an all-volunteer era. And it's mostly, there's men and women. There's less of a difference with women, but more with men. And it said men with military service had a higher prevalence of ACEs in all 11 categories than men without military service. Notably, in the all-volunteer era, men with military service had twice the odds twice of reporting forced sex. Let's see, in addition, men with a history of military service had twice the prevalence of all, and this is in the all-volunteer era, not in the draft, because it was a little more of a cross-section, but folks that volunteer had more than twice the prevalence. They also had twice the prevalence of having 4 or more categories in 4 or more ACEs. So, and there's more, but ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. My bad, I'm sorry. Yep, adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. We have a question right here. Thanks so much. This research was done in 10 states with 60,000 folks. And I'm just going to tell one part of the conclusion, and we'll get to the question. It says respondents who experienced parental divorce and child abuse. Nope, I don't want to read that. Okay, sorry. Let's have the question. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Currently in my family, we have a family member that is in the Army, and he's just finished boot camp, and then he wants to be in the Rangers, so he's moving up in that area. And,
just for information, Rangers are the tip of the spear. They jump into combat. Their whole thing is to be first in, last out.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, that's, yeah.
It's dangerous.
It is, yes, and it's something he's always wanted. So during boot camp, there were several suicides.
Mm-hmm.
He's moving into another higher level, and there's been suicides within the week that they get there. So, I mean, I know it's a part of this, but I think just hearing it on a more personal level, it's
Yeah.
very overwhelming to
Yeah.
think that it happens
Absolutely.
so fast.
I appreciate that. And it's so scary. And I'll talk about it. I got the statistics. Generally, we've heard that it's 22 veterans and active duty folks killing themselves. Is it yearly, monthly, daily? The stats now are 20. So the current stats are 20. And most of that are veterans as opposed to active duty. But there is a much higher prevalence of suicide amongst active duty folks. I wonder, I haven't done the study, but again, lower self-esteem, not feeling good about myself. You look at alcohol abuse, you look at less risk averse, you look at willingness to be in a dangerous, risky situation. There's a lot of great avoidance. You get some cool accolades. You're young and impressionable. The uniform looks good. You get guns. That's mostly, and that's what we're talking about. We're talking about kind of the history of military, and that's the hyper-masculinity. It's shifting. It's changing. I just got on a side note, and there's no research to this. This is just me. My experience with women in the military that have risen to the top have had to outman the men at every step because they're under more scrutinization. So they've had to, and they've had to figure out how to rise up in a male organization by outmanning the men. And when they get to that top level, my experience is that they're less supportive of women that are just coming into the service. I've done it. I did it the hard way. You're going to have to too. When they're in positions of leadership and I'm like, well, this is a victim, and of course they're going to be overweight. They're having trouble sleeping. They're having trouble getting their uniform together. They're having trouble making decisions. They're having trouble showing up on time. All of these things which are critical to military service, they're drinking too much alcohol. They ended up in a compromised situation. They shouldn't have been sexually assaulted because they were drunk and in a bad place. And I've heard just kind of horrible stuff from some higher up women in the military. Anyway, I don't want to go any further on that, okay? I'll hit the suicide stuff in a minute. So hero complex, low esteem, need to help, this codependent, this risk taker, this defensiveness, this armoring, this posturing, this protection, this controlling type A, alpha male, rigid gender roles. What else did I have in here? Guns. Tend to be conservative, tend to be Republican. Not all. There are plenty that aren't, and things are moving. And then Dr. Gonzalez had that the norms are often extended. The traditional masculine are extended in the military. I mean, it's the locker room all over. And most people grow out of it. So many people had a tough time in high school and realize now as they're older that high school was not life. But in high school, it seemed like life. And the military service can really be seen as an extension of kind of high school in a lot of ways, you know, because of the things we talked about, the 3 hots and a cot, the over-controlling, overbearing, the control of the military. All right, so repress, deny emotions, gender strain, struggle to conform, be cool or be cast out. All right.